corporate courts are formally known as Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. And you may well have heard me or my colleagues talk about corporate court cases previously. A tobacco company that sued the government for introducing plain packaging on cigarettes. Water company that sued when there's a cap on consumer water prices during a financial crisis. These cases are the reason why we work on corporate courts. It's a fundamentally unjust system that provides a privileged legal system only accessible by corporations, which they have used to challenge governments over health, over environment, over public services, over the right to regulate. And that's been the reason why we've been working on them for these years. And among the cases that I used to talk about, one of them was a climate-related case, a case called Lone Pine, who are suing the Canadian government over the introduction of a fracking moratorium in Quebec. And I used to talk about it because it was a climate case amongst other examples on other issues. I also use it to talk about as an illustration of a pattern that you quite often get with some of these corporate court cases, where they come after there has been a people's victory. So there had been campaigning for like 10 years around fracking and climate in Quebec. There had been protests, there have been marches, there have been petitions. Eventually, the government introduces a review. The review leads to the success of the introduction of a moratorium. And then along comes the corporate court case that just gets slapped down on top of it. And then, you know, amongst these cases, I realized there's another climate-related case turning up. In this case, a UK company called Rockhopper, which is suing Italy when Italy introduces a ban on oil drilling close to the coast. And then it clicks for me that this is that same pattern writ large. So governments have been dragging their feet on climate action for decades. There has been campaigning, there has been protests, there have been pressure for decades. Eventually, too slow, too late, too little, but action is being dragged out of them. And that action is a threat to corporate power. The things that we need to do to tackle the climate crisis, many of them are quite fundamental challenges to the power, to the profits, to the status quo of corporations. And where do they turn? They turn to the system that is designed to protect their status quo, to protect corporate power. So of course, as climate action begins, we begin to see corporate court cases seeking to block, to slow, to undermine that. And they have rolled out. There are a couple of cases around coal phase outs in the Netherlands and in Canada. Very recently, the cancellation of the tar sands pipeline that was going from the US to Canada. Another UK company called Ascent Resources is suing the Slovenian government for daring to require it to do an environmental impact assessment on its fracking plans. The cases are coming. So what is the corporate court system? Well, it's written into trade and investment rules. It's part of trade rules. And as I say, it allows corporations to sue governments outside of the national legal system in ad hoc tribunals that are set up just to look at the issues that the corporations bring up. One of the advantages for the corporations is that those tribunals only have to look at whether the investors' interests have been affected. So that tobacco case that I mentioned, that was Philip Morris suing Australia some years ago now. Philip Morris also sued in the national courts and they lost. And if you look at the final judgment and you do Control F for public health, it's all the way through the judgment. The whole judgment is about the balance of, okay, the company's interests on the one hand, but the public health imperative on the other hand, where does the balance lie? The corporate court tribunal doesn't have to do that. It's just, were the company's interests affected? Yes, full stop. Public health, interesting, not relevant. Other cases, human rights, interesting, not relevant. We can guess exactly what's going to be the same looking at climate change. Interesting, not relevant. Other reasons why corporations turn to corporate courts are the huge amounts that they can get, far more than they would get if they tried to bring a challenge in the national legal system. So Rockhopper, and this is something that their CEO has said openly, they invested about 40 to 50 million so far in the oil concession that they had off the Italian coast. They're not suing to recover just that 40, 50 million. They reckon that if the drilling had been able to go ahead, if there was as much oil in that field as they think it had, if the oil price never dropped, if nothing ever went wrong, they reckon that they'd have made profits of 200 to 300 million. So that's what they're suing for. Actually, in the scale of the way that corporate court cases are going, although that's ridiculously large, it's becoming relatively small. Corporate court cases used to all be in the hundreds of millions. A few years ago, the first case broke the billion barrier, and we were all shocked. Now there are a dozen or more cases above $1 billion. Case in the Netherlands, $1.5 billion. The very recent case a few weeks ago, the Tarsans case that Stu will talk about, that was as though they were going, $1.5 million, hold my beer, look what I can do. They're suing for 15 billion, which is a little off the scale. These cases are also about far more often than they seem to be about. They have a chilling effect. So sometimes cases are so secretive that you can't even find out that they're happening. Other times, the companies are very public. They shout very loud about what they're doing. And in that case, they are seeking to have an effect much wider than the case they are actually brilliant. So again, that tobacco case, when Philip Morris was suing Australia, Australia wasn't the only country that was looking at plain packaging at the time. When that case happened, all the other countries looking at it just quietly, one way or another, put their plans on hold. We'll just wait and see what happens. And they waited a few years. Philip Morris actually lost that case on a technicality, and those countries, mostly rich countries, then went ahead with their plans. We know that's bad enough. We know we can't afford to just hang around for a few more years with climate action. But I recently read something that's even worse. It says that that chilling effect lasted for the duration of the case in rich countries. But in many countries in the global south, in poor countries, that chilling effect is still going on. Those countries know that they are far more at risk. They cannot afford the millions that it'll cost just to fight the case, let alone the risk of losing. And so those companies will hold back. They will do less. They will not necessarily do what they were planning to do. They will not do what is needed because they are afraid of the risk of a corporate court case. So cases that we see at the minute that are ostensibly being brought against countries in Europe or North America, those cases are having a global effect. They are really threatening climate action. So that's the system. I tell people about this as a system and they're like, yes, but that's outrageous. How could it even ever have come to exist? Why do we have this? And that's where you go back in the history and say, well, we have this because it was invented by the fossil fuel companies and the bankers. You go back to the 1950s and the context of countries newly achieving, former colonies newly achieving their independence and saying really dangerous things like, now that we're independent, we control our own resources. And fossil fuel companies go, no, that's not how the world works. We own your resources. They're our assets. Hang on, we can't be having this. We need to do something about this. A couple of people, German banker called Hermann Abs and a lawyer who worked at that point for what was called Royal Dutch Shell, they came up with a draft of a set of rules around investment. They called it a Magna Carta to protect foreign interests. And they started shopping that around, trying to persuade governments to take it up. They didn't quite get sort of one global treaty over the whole world, but it was taken up by governments. What they proposed turned in the 1960s to the first ISDS deals. And that's where the system comes from. And that's why now we come full circle. And the fossil fuel companies, faced with the challenge of climate action, are turning back to a system that was designed precisely by fossil fuel companies to protect their assets. It's a toxic system. We need to get rid of it. Is the UK government therefore getting rid of it? No, the UK government is trying to put corporate courts into all of the new trade deals that it is negotiating. It wants corporate courts in trade deal with Canada. It is trying to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has corporate courts in it. It is recommitting itself to an existing corporate court trade deal called the Energy Charter Treaty. However, we believe there is hope that they can be forced to back down. There was an outcry around the UK-Australia deal, and for the moment, we hope that we have kept corporate courts out of that. We hope that if we take action now, if we pull this out into the open, if enough people speak out, we can try and block the action of corporate courts. That's I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jean. And so without further ado, let's hear from Niels, who I think is going to maybe expand a bit on the Energy Charter Treaty and also talk about the specific cases that have been happening in the Netherlands. So.
Absolutely. It's like Jean and I have been in multiple presentations together, because I'm hopefully going to build seamlessly on what Jean told us. Having said seamlessly, I will need to share my screen, and multitasking is not my strong suit, so bear with me for a second when I grab the presentation. And there we go. Oh wait, that's the last slide. All right, there we start. Indeed, my name is Niels Jongerius. I work at the Amsterdam-based Transnational Institute. As the name suggests, we're a global operation. We're a think tank doing research, advocacy for well over 40 years. We have our office in Amsterdam, but most of my colleagues work in a global context. And as was already alluded, I root our organization with the Dutch social movements. I thought it was nice to also bring some pictures, because a lot of the discussion around these corporate courts, around ISDS, around these cases is quite technical. And as somebody working with campaign organizations, it's sometimes very necessary to make it real, to make it vivid, to make it live. So I've put in a number of photos from one of our most recent actions, photo credits by Anjo de Haan. And as Jean was saying, indeed, this corporate court system, or ISDS, has 50 years of history, 50 years of history that is closely tied from a Dutch perspective to Dutch colonial and international economic history. It was invented by Shell corporate lawyers, Royal Dutch Shell being the biggest transnational corporation based in the Netherlands. It was first introduced in the bilateral investment treaty between the Netherlands and Indonesia, then the former colony of the Netherlands, with a lot of investment coming from companies like Shell into Indonesia. And as Jean was saying, they were pretty afraid that these newly independent countries would start democratically running their economy and thus taking some form of control over assets that rightfully belong to the Indonesian people, not to Royal Dutch Shell or any other colonial enterprise. So more than 50 years ago, this system came into being through an investment treaty that the Netherlands signed into existence. But in those 50 years, the Netherlands itself has not been challenged as a nation by any external companies. Only last year did these cases materialize. On the other hand, due to its role in the global economy, which is quite similar to the City of London as a global tax haven, a place where letterbox companies from around the globe register themselves, the Netherlands has been the second most used jurisdiction to sue other countries from. So you see a lot of, for instance, Canadian mining companies, Australian mining companies registering a letterbox company in the Netherlands, and then through a bilateral investment treaty of the Netherlands and, say, Mongolia, suing the Mongolian government as if this Canadian or Australian company was theoretically based in the Netherlands. And I think for us, on the campaigning side of things in the Netherlands, it is crucial that now we see the flip side of this economic policy that the Netherlands has been aggressively expanding across the globe coming home. And indeed, I wanted to say a few words about the Energy Charter Treaty, as it's both the treaty that is used most around the globe to sue countries through the ISDS system. And I think it's both a very clear and present danger to effective climate action, as well as it is the treaty that is being used now by 2 coal companies to sue the Netherlands. And even with everything at stake in our global crises, the pundits behind the Energy Charter Treaty are still trying to expand all around the globe, mostly in Africa and Asia, to have more countries put under this regime, and we're actively trying to stop that. Concretely, what is happening in the Netherlands? The Netherlands, after massive political protests, and quite famously, I think also beyond the Netherlands, through the groundbreaking real court case by an environmental organization called Urgenda, they pushed the state up to the highest court to push them to take more effective climate measures based on human rights concerns. And because of that real court ruling, in 2019, the Netherlands accepted a coal phase out for electricity production by 2030. As part of that law, the companies that were still burning coals for energy production were offered hundreds of millions per plant in compensation. Most of the companies involved in burning fossil fuels accepted those compensation. 2 companies did not. Uniper is a subsidiary of the state-owned Finnish Fortum, and German RWE is a little bit more known around the world as one of those companies that really digs up coal as well in Germany, like devouring entire villages and countryside in its wake. Uniper has claimed 850 million, which is half of their entire investment into this plant, and RWE has claimed currently we're guessing 1.4 billion, and in the same breath, more or less, RWE also hired a former MP as the new head of public affairs because they kind of saw that people were kind of getting angry about a €1 billion claim, that they needed some power and influence to look better in the public eye. Of course, RWE is already a hated company, but suing for 1.4 billion has made them even less likable, even by those who are politically usually close to them. We have a very different parliamentary system than the UK. We have about 12 parties in parliament. Currently, it could be 13 tomorrow. The traditional left has always opposed this, but the center and the center right have supported these corporate court systems. But even those were outraged in parliament that the Netherlands was being sued by RWE. So there was a hearing in parliament, and even those who normally defend any corporation were like saying, this is not what the system was supposed to be for. We, the Netherlands, were supposed to only like help our companies sue those countries over there, making over all kinds of colonial overtures and saying this was not what the system was invented for. So that has helped to put some parliamentary pressure on these cases, but parliamentarians usually never spring into action unless there is public outrage. So there's a Europe-wide petition to exit the Energy Charter Treaty. And with these specific cases against the Netherlands, we campaign with allies in Germany, allies in Finland to put pressure on these companies, not only in Dutch Parliament, not only in Dutch society, but also abroad. And luckily, we were able to get our first COVID-proof action off the ground, which is where most of the pictures are coming from. It was in the far, far north, actually at the seaside of the Netherlands, where RWE has its power plant. We traveled there together with people from the trade justice movement, but more importantly for our alliance building. And this is something that we really want to stress. We had the vice chair of the Dutch trade union, which is the top photo, and the real core organizer, the face of Fridays for Futures in the Netherlands there as well. So we try to make this not just a trade and investment issue, but more seriously, we make this about labor, about workers' rights, about the environment, about the future of young people, to make sure that this is not something that is being technicalized, being put only as a technical issue, but it's felt as something that a lot of people have a stake in. And for instance, if you relate to the workers, they know that they won't get the amounts that RWE is suing the Dutch state for, as we see from the phase out at the other coal plants, that the compensation that the workers are being offered is minimal compared to the hundreds of millions that the companies rake in. So with tactical alliances with trade union and climate activists, we try to make this a broad issue. I've promised to keep it short as there's room for Q&A and discussion. I've really skipped over some details that my research colleagues would hate if get lost. So I want to point to a number of key researches that are out there. Find them on energycharterdirtysecrets.org. Find them on our TNI website, or maybe find them through links that might be shared by our colleagues. And these are my contact details if you want to pose specific questions to the Netherlands outside of this session, and I'll answer some specific questions later at the discussion. And I'll stop sharing now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Niels. And if you want to, maybe just in the next few minutes, if like you could post the Energy Charter Treaty Secrets website in the chat, and people will be able to have a live link for that as well. And just to say before I bring Stuart in, we're gonna have a chance for questions. The best way to communicate those questions that you might have is to use the Q&A function. So if you've got something to ask, put it in there. Yeah, I mean, by all means, put other things in the chat. But the Q&A is going to be the clearest way to get those across, and I'll bring them in for the speakers after everyone's spoken. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stuart.
Thanks very much, James. I'm going to share my screen as well, so everyone can hear me okay. Okay. How's that looking? If I play from the start. There we go. Okay. Hope that looks okay. So hi everyone. My name is Stuart True with the CCPA. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada, which is in the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, spanning large parts of what we now call Ontario and Quebec. This land acknowledgement it helps draw attention, I think, to the relatively recent colonization and settlement of this continent of North America by Europeans and the corresponding dispossession and genocide of indigenous peoples. I think for our purposes here, it's worth noting that this dispossession occurred both by force and through laws that were based on racial myths and other ideas at the time about the primacy of trade, primacy of property rights, and its connection to the so-called improvement or use of allegedly vacant or unimproved lands. And it was basically about, extracting wealth unhindered by local opposition. So, as others have mentioned on this presentation already, those ideas and myths set a foundation for imperialism, but they also continue to underpin essentially these treaties we've been talking about and the regime that is established through investor-state dispute settlement. And so I think we think about, in this presentation, we think about the barriers to climate policy that ISDS creates. I think it's important also in Canada, but also the United States, Latin America, and even in parts of Europe that we think about the consequences of ISDS for and the global trade regime generally, I think, for the rights of indigenous peoples. So let's see if I just go to the first slide. A little bit about the CCPA. You can read up on who we are here. Earlier this year, I took over from Scott Sinclair, who has been the director of the Trade Investment Research Project at the CCPA for 20 years. And much of what I'll be talking about draws from his most recent report that he did for us in April, called The Rise and Demise of NAFTA Chapter 11, which was the ISDS process in the North American Free Trade Agreement. My colleague, Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, just for your information, is also currently revising his database of Canadian ISDS cases abroad. So not only do we know, and I'll show you the stats in a second, that the use of ISDS in North America has been primarily, overwhelmingly, to challenge environmental and resource management decisions. The same can be shown for Canadian ISDS cases abroad, as I'm sure many people on this presentation are already aware, given the prevalence of Canadian mining companies operating globally. So I'll go on to the first slide here. Big picture. I'm going to go from big picture and then come back to the TC Energy case and spend most of my time there, I think. This stuff might be common knowledge to people who've been looking into ISDS for a while, but just in case not, again, it's pulled from Scott's recent report. Just to say that, Canada was considered, when NAFTA was signed, an investment exporting country. So the idea was that Canadian investment abroad would be protected. And we weren't too worried about, what would happen. And no one was really thinking about it, essentially, when we agreed to this investment chapter in the NAFTA. And what happened very quickly was a number of environmental measures and others in the United States and Canada and Mexico were being challenged. And there was a bit of a panic. But just to say that the legacy of NAFTA up until the renegotiation was that we were the most sued country. We frequently lost claims that we should have won. If the right to regulate was in fact protected, or if these treaties were being interpreted narrowly, when in fact they were being interpreted quite broadly, the rights of these corporations were being interpreted broadly. We paid out, $260 million in awards and settlements, legal costs on top of that are still accruing, as we have these 5 pending cases that are making their way through the process, very lengthy process. And that doesn't count these new legacy claims that I'll talk about in a second in the USMCA. This is just a way to kind of visualize the impact on Canada or on the other countries as well in terms of the NAFTA cases. So we are at the top. Cases against Mexico are increasing. So they, at some point, I think very soon, Mexico will bump above us there. The United States is low on the list, and it's worth noting the United States has still never lost a claim. Here's a way to kind of break the numbers down by measures challenged. So as I was saying, you can see from the 2 top bars that primarily more than 2/3 of cases in Canada are targeting environmental protection measures and resource management measures. And here's another way to visualize that in a pie chart form. So we do have these other cases that we won't talk about today with respect to public services or even the intellectual property rights regime in Canada. So some of the key environmental disputes, I would say, I won't go into these in too much detail. I would say in general, they serve to reinforce what Niles and Jean have already said about ISDS as a barrier to effective climate action. But just briefly to go through them, Clayton Bilcon, this was a case involving a very large quarry that underwent an environmental assessment process in Nova Scotia, out eastern Canada, and this process determined it shouldn't go ahead. It would have had too big an impact on the St. Lawrence River and ecosystem, for example, and the public didn't want it to move ahead. Anyway, we lost that claim in what was described by the dissenting arbitrator in that case as a huge setback for environmental assessment policy in Canada. There was the Mobil and Murphy oil case. So this is where we had carved out what we thought were protections for performance requirements on offshore oil development in Newfoundland and Labrador. This was carved out of NAFTA, we thought, but this tribunal decided expansively, no, in fact, you shouldn't have assumed it was carved out. Any changes to those policies after '94 would have been covered, and so you therefore owe these companies their money back, essentially, for this money that they were asked to invest in research and development in the process. And that award will basically compensate these firms for having to do what every other company in the region has to do, which is reinvest some of their profits in the province. Lone Pine, what Jean talked about, it was the fracking case. We have this Westmoreland coal case. It's a coal mining firm that is challenging a coal power phase out, right? So you can see where how ridiculous that is, saying that this was going to undermine their profits, when in fact most of the coal would have probably been exported and not gone toward these power generation facilities. And then we have these famous Ethel and S.D. Myers cases involving Ethel was the phase out of a gasoline additive in Canada, the prohibition on trade in gasoline containing this known carcinogen, where we settled with the firm. And S.D. Myers involved a temporary ban on imports of toxic waste from the United States, which was required by Canada, arguably under our other international treaties. So these, and there were several under the Green Energy Act related to the procurement in the province, procurement of green energy and whatnot. So very much very controversial claims that we did lose in many cases. Some are ongoing. And clearly do, I think, underline what we've been talking about on this call. And so, it's given this experience, I think it's kind of quite reasonable for the Trudeau government to, in 2018, at the removal of ISDS from the new NAFTA, from this USMCA, we have this great quote from now our finance minister, but she was foreign affairs minister at the time, saying that, isn't it great we did this? This was a huge victory for sovereignty and for the right to regulate in the public interest. Now, having said that, we do have these legacy claims. So, this is a clause that was put into the USMCA. I don't know why. Seems like a huge mistake, especially at this time where we're going to be, governments are finally waking up to the challenge of having to put into place stricter rules on emissions and very quickly decarbonizing our economies and our energy systems. And yet we have this kind of minimal zombie clause, in which NAFTA continues to exist for 3 years. And anyone who was an investor between '94 and 2020 can file claims. So we see that we've had the first case, legacy claim, was brought by Koch Industries, challenging, the major energy, coal and dirty oil interest in the United States, challenging a decision in Ontario to basically scrap our cap and trade program. So, amazingly, oh, James, am I running out of time? Yeah. Okay, I'll skip ahead then. So we can go over these in the questions if people have any questions. Essentially, this the TC Energy case, I'll just say, is a legacy claim. I think that, as we would suspect, as most other of these cases, the RWE cases and others have cited, that this violates their national treatment, their most favored nation treatment, and it violates rules in NAFTA on expropriation and minimum standards of treatment. It's a fairly standard oil industry case against an environmental measure, which in this case was the denial of their permit to build the Keystone pipeline. As we talked about, it's a huge case. It's $15 billion, and this would account for not only the investments they continued to make in the United States, even though they didn't have the permit, but it accounts for potential future profit losses as well, which I think is where it gets ridiculous. And it looks like I'm running out of time, but just in summary, like Jean was saying, the company should have known there's no way, that this was going to be profitable in the long run, given what we know about climate change, the IPCC statements, now the International Energy Agency statements about how we have to leave this stuff in the ground. You know, the company should have known better, but alas, they have this mechanism whereby they can actually get a pretty good deal by going outside the courts and suing for billions of dollars of lost profits through ISDS. You know, I won't go into this in too much detail, but this was what the company has a problem with. They have the problem with this so-called arbitrary nature of the decision on the part of the government. But the point I would like to make is just that this is going to be messy. You know, so as we look to transition off of coal and oil and gas, there's not going to be a so-called science-based or simple or clearly transparent. It's all going to be messy. It's all going to come down to politics and trade-offs. But it has to happen quickly, and we cannot let ISDS be just another hurdle in the way of that. We just have to accept that this is part of the democratic process. So, you know, this is one of the reasons, and this is my last slide, James, that the CCPA has been endorsing at the Canadian level that we really get out of the ISDS system. I mean, Canada has proposed this kind of new model investment treaty that it will be trying to include, I believe, as a baseline in the UK negotiations, but I don't think we can accept the reasoning behind that it is somehow better or create space for the right to regulate. It's just not tested. And we have evidence that in fact it would completely allow cases like the Keystone to move forward. So we have these demands, which, you know, other countries are actually doing. You know, if you look at Pakistan, or if you look at Ecuador, Bolivia, they are heeding these calls to remove ISDS from their investment treaties, and they're looking at different ways that incorporate local arbitration or the courts in order to settle these disputes. And I think that's something we should be pursuing quite strongly with our governments. So thanks very much, and apologies for going a bit over, and I look forward to questions.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Stuart. So just to say, there was a couple of people who've sort of put their hands up. I'm not going to be able to bring you directly in, but you're very welcome to put your questions in into that Q&A. We've got some good questions already. I mean, one question that was there's some immediately factual questions, I think, and one is simply that there was a question: is this just one way? You know, and yeah, we're all nodding because yes, it is just one way, and that's part of the injustice of it. It is just for corporations to be able to sue governments in other countries, and that's the key thing here. Jean, maybe do you want to say anything more about that, and also maybe about the question? Well, somebody's asked who adjudicates in these courts, so that's another one that you could maybe deal with on the kind of like immediate factual level.
Yeah, so no, these corporate courts are designed only for corporations to be able to use them. It's not designed for governments to hold corporations to account in any way. There's no responsibility required of corporate courts. It's only for them to be able to bring challenges. Each tribunal is set up sort of ad hoc of itself. 3 adjudicators will be appointed, one by the country, one by the company, and one by both together. One of the problems with this very sort of secretive internal way of working is that the people appointed are corporate lawyers who specialize in investment law, many of whom also work as the lawyers for the companies in other cases. So they have a huge conflict of interest, and they're also totally bought into the system. They also may, you know, that one of the reasons that when I was saying they won't necessarily pay any attention to sort of human rights or wider issues is because they're investment lawyers. They're not necessarily lawyers who have a wide understanding or perspective on other areas. So yeah, that's the answer to those ones.
And I also saw there was I think maybe you've been answering you've been answering these in the chat, Niels. But maybe for people that haven't seen that, there was a question around whether there was actually already been with the Uniper and RWE cases, where the government had already compensated those companies for the fact that they were going to have to close down their operations?
So yeah, the answer is the government. There were quite a few coal-fired power plants still in operation. Some were close to its natural lifespan, if you can say natural there. So the owners were quite pleased by an offer for compensation for earlier closure, as they were neither profitable nor had a future in the long run. So that goes for, I think, 8 out of 10 of the coal plant owners in the Netherlands. They accepted compensation or are in discussion with the government about finalizing that compensation. RWE and Uniper were also offered compensation, but they declined, thinking that they could leverage more through ISDS claims and could even drive up the price for the compensation that the Netherlands might be willing to offer to them in an outside of corporate court settlement. So there we go.
So I've seen a few questions, a few people asking basically the question, why on earth would a government sign up to this system in the first place? Why is it any government's interest to sign up to this system? I don't know who wants to have a go at that. Maybe Stuart,
I could try.
go ahead.
I'll try a quick one, and it's not the only answer, but I think in the case of Canada, I mean, governments believe in this system, right? They strongly believe in it's part of the so-called rules-based international order, and it's a price they're willing to take, I think, at home. These cases coming up for the protection of their own investors abroad, but deep down they do believe that there are limits to government action affecting companies, affecting investors, and that they should be enforced somehow, and you know, that process should be globalized in a sense. It should be the same everywhere. They believe that very strongly.
But it is actually the case that there are some governments that are starting to pull out of agreements with ISDS, including the Energy Charter Treaty, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and there are countries who have never accepted ISDS. So Brazil, for instance, never signed, because I mean, one of the rationales for this is that this will encourage investment. And that's also the pressure, the strong pressure, you know, even if a country does not necessarily, the government completely believe in the sort of the theory around ISDS, but the pressure, well, if you don't do this, then you will be weakening investor confidence, and then investors will not invest in your country, and you will weaken your credit rating, and you know, you will be shooting yourselves in the foot if you don't sign up to investment treaties. There's no actual conclusive evidence that there is any link between these treaties and increases in investment. Countries like Brazil, who refuse to ever completely sign up to these, have not been short of investment. If you ask investors, you know, what did you base your investment decision on, then they will say perfectly reasonable things like because it was close to my market, or because there was a natural resources that I needed to access, or there's a skilled workforce, or there's good transportation links, or, you know, all of the things that you would expect investments to be based upon, not the existence of this, which just comes as a sort of a cherry on the top, the icing that lawyers can later use. I think there was also a point between sort of the origins of ISDS back in the sort of the 60s and 70s, and then there were actually not that many cases, and there was a time when, you know, some countries almost signed up to them just as a gesture to show willing, not realizing what the impact could be 10 years later, and seeing the impacts. And yes, some countries are seeking, so I said somebody's asking, can you leave? Yes, some countries are trying to, some countries are seeking to extricate themselves, either by, some of these treaties do have a sort of a review point or a close point, and when you get to that, to try and close them down, or seeking to repudiate the system altogether, to make a declaration that they step out and do that. And a country like New Zealand has adopted a position against accepting new ISDS treaties, and is trying to, therefore, hopefully will be refusing to have it in the UK-New Zealand trade agreement. But certainly there's a growing consensus. South Africa, India, these countries are looking at other options.
So yeah, thanks. Does anybody, I mean, jump in, either the other two of you, if you want to, on any of these.
If I could too, just to go back on my first answer. I mean, yeah. Canada doesn't necessarily believe that these things are good. I feel like our Trade Department does, and we have this statement, as I was saying, from Global Affairs, from Chrystia Freeland, suggesting otherwise. So there's some conflict there. But the removal of ISDS from NAFTA is massive, right? It happened, right? It happened, and it's being celebrated by the Biden administration and the current Trudeau government. And it should be an example for other countries too, right?
So
Can I add a little bit to that? Because I think there's an important dynamic there, where in most of our day-to-day affairs around ISDS, this is the department of only a very small and select circle of people, the lawyers involved, the companies involved, a few government administrators, and some researchers and campaigners who make this their life's work. But for most of the people, the general public, and even high-level government officials, they don't know what the deal is. When our Minister of Energy had to answer questions in Parliament, he didn't know what he was talking about. He was just, speaking untruths in Parliament simply because he did not know what this treaty was about, what ISDS is about, and that goes, I think, at large for the political sphere. So it is in our interest to make these cases known, well known, and to pile up public pressure so that government officials start to worry about public pressure, start to backtrack on them just taking this for granted and starting to think about exit strategies sooner rather than later. Because as somebody indeed questioned, like, what is up with, like, can cases still be filed if we exit? And for instance, in the Energy Charter Treaty, once again, the most used treaty for these cases, there's a sunset clause. And Italy, for instance, has left the Energy Charter Treaty, and it's being sued after it's left. And it will remain possible for these companies to sue for decades, even after. If the Netherlands would now leave, politically, I support that, but still the legal mechanisms of the Energy Charter Treaty would make it possible for these companies to sue even in 10, 15, 20 years.
And that's one of the things, isn't it, that these deals are so enforceable in international law, whereas climate deals and what have you are much less enforceable, actually. And I think that's one of the, because we've got people asking, well, can't companies be countersued, or what's the actually, it's the primacy is for trade law, right? There's another interesting question here. What would happen if countries refused to pay if they lost? And I understand, I think, Jean, you were telling me this was actually happening in one case, maybe with India, is it?
Yeah, so another UK energy company called Cairn Energy had an ISDS case against India. It's to do, yeah. It was selling some oil concession between one TNC and another TNC, and they were both claiming that because neither of them were in India, when they were selling it from one to the other, they didn't have to pay tax in India. India had a different view and tried to charge them back taxes. That's what the case was around. The company won the case. India so far is saying taxes are its sovereign issue. It refuses to accept that jurisdiction. So a few weeks ago, Can Energy won a case asking a court in France to allow it to seize assets of the Indian government in Paris. The Indian government owns some flats and other property in Paris. It's also been trying to seize some airplanes owned by the Indian government. So this is one of the reasons companies will seize your assets overseas if you don't pay.
So yeah, scary. There's a couple of people have asked, and we're coming sort of to the end of the scheduled time. I do want to make, one of the things we wanted to finish off with is just to make people aware, which I'll come to in a minute, is we're going to have a day of action in the UK against ISDS, particularly around the climate theme on the 18th of September. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a minute. There's a couple of people have said, clearly ISDS is very relevant for the climate. So isn't it going to be discussed at COP26? Isn't it going to come up there? No. Why not?
Because our international system is siloed, and because trade overrides voluntary climate agreements, and the COP is not allowed to talk about such things because they belong to the important world of trade and investment agreements. And such things do not get onto the COP agenda, where they might be discussed from the perspective of the impact upon climate change, rather than the perspective of whether they impact upon business profits. Is a short answer. There are maybe more diplomatic answers.
Great. I'm just looking through to see if I can throw in any more so Maria's asked again about, or maybe we've covered that, about there's a replacement for NAFTA, right? That's the you've been talking about that, Stuart. That's the they replaced NAFTA, and the corporate costs are not included in that. Great. Do we know why the UK government backtracked on ISDS in the UK-Australia deal? Any clues?
Partly because it became public, and because there was pressure both here in the UK from groups such as us and groups in Australia, where I mean, corporate courts are fairly notorious in Australia because of the Philip Morris case, and the UK government's preeminent aim at the moment is to get trade deals quickly. And if there's something like corporate courts that are becoming highly controversial, highly sensitive, then they may be prepared to back down, drop those things in search of the prize of getting the trade deal done quickly. This is my hope, because this means that they may do it again. Unfortunately, the other version is also that they are also seeking to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership includes Australia and Canada, and already has corporate courts in it. So it is also possible for them to try and get it via two different routes, which is also why we need to oppose joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
So the questions have been coming thick and fast. I'm not going to get through all of them, but there is one here saying simply, how do we get rid of the Energy Charter Treaty? Maybe that's one for you, Niels.
Yeah, luckily there is indeed the example of Italy exiting this unilaterally, but as I explained, there is still the sunset clause, which makes that only a feasible strategy for non-climate related emergency things. I mean, it's still good that in a couple of dozen years, it's no longer the case that tobacco companies can sue you, but the climate doesn't wait for that, and the Energy Charter Treaty is specifically on the energy system as we have it. So what we're trying to do now is, through governments who are also critical, try to have a concerted pullout by an X number of governments. We know that the Luxembourg government is very critical, the Spanish government as well, as they are being sued left and right. The French government is also similarly very critical and put under a lot of pressure by social movements there. And interestingly, we've heard rumors that also the Polish government seems movable into a more critical position. We don't know why or how that is happening in Poland, but at least it seems that, once again, public pressure helps in moving government to our position. We're trying to do the same in the Netherlands. Obviously, these two cases against the Netherlands help to show the danger of this treaty. And we are at least somewhat positive that we can move the Dutch government into an either-or position, where they say either there are significant changes to the Energy Charter Treaty as it stands, or we will look to exit. As Japan is blocking all serious modernization, there's not going to be any modernization. Therefore, exiting the ECT becomes the only feasible strategy for governments who've made such a pledge. That is our strategy. Don't go blurt it out to the Dutch government, but this is what we're trying to do. And forcing any other government to criticize the Energy Charter Treaty and to raise serious doubts helps in that, as the more governments derail this system of power, it becomes ever more difficult to sustain it.
So one of the two of the questions that are have been asked there, we're not perhaps going to come to, but I think maybe I can see Jean's typing an answer to one of them now, so that's great. I don't know that everybody's going to see that, but the short answer is there aren't currently any cases against the UK, but precisely the danger with this is that if the government does ever do anything right on climate, preventing the oil field that's in potential off the north of Scotland at the moment, for instance, there is the danger of them being sued by one of those companies. But it has to be it has to be as part of a treaty between two sovereign states. So there's a question there about the international organizations being at risk of this, and that's not, my understanding is that's not a risk, but it's because these are all as the result of provisions in treaties between two or more sovereign states. What I'm just going to go to now is, I mentioned the day of action, and I just want to show you some slides about that. So hopefully, sorry, right. Just basically, hopefully you can all see this. Saturday, the 18th of September, we want to get people around the country out and campaigning in various ways, whatever way works in your area, against against ISDS, in these new trade deals or renewed trade deals that the UK is signing, and also directly against the Energy Charter Treaty. And our campaign materials all cover all of those things. We've got a few different ideas, and we're still developing this, but I want to get this in now. We wanted to have this before people kind of go into maybe a bit of a lull of politics over August. Traditionally, we like to do that, but we wanted to get this webinar in now so people can start thinking about what they might do on the 18th of September. That could be a protest somewhere in the UK. We've got a list of potential places you could do that in different areas. It's not going to work everywhere, but there's quite a few different options. You could just do a campaign stall in your high street, for instance, on that day. That works as well. Or if you want to go, one step further, we've got a big projector we like to use to project things. a projection on a relevant office or even a power station could work very well. So we've put up a page on our website. You can find it via globaljustice.org.uk/events. And just so you know, these are the materials that we can send out to you around this issue. So we've got a briefing, 4-page briefing there covering the issue, answering some of those questions. We've got a shorter leaflet that covers more trade and climate change and trade in general. And then you'll see at the bottom, that's one side of the campaign postcard, which also has some information on it. So it sort of acts as a leaflet as well. But that can be then sent off, and it's addressed to Johnson and also to Liz Truss, the International Trade Secretary. So those things are already in existence. We can send them out to you. Just email activism@globaljustice.org.uk to get hold of them. We're also just now making an A2 size placard. So we're going to make a load of these, print a load of these up. They could potentially be useful for a protest, or just on a stall to draw attention. They'll be A2s, fairly big, sort of poster size, and they should be stand out well. So you'll be able to order some of those as well, and we'll have to work out how to post them to you because they're quite large. But if you're doing an action or a stall, they could be useful. So bear those in mind. The key thing, and I'm just going to stop sharing and make sure that we've got the link there, which is that the key thing is make sure in the first instance that you sign up to get our emails if you don't already get them.
I've put the links in the chat.
Great. Okay, that's wonderful. I'm having to come out of my, sorry. Start using different screens. And so there's the link. Sign to make sure you get our emails. Many of you already will, and that's probably, might be why you're on here today. There's also, Jean's put there the page, the direct link as well to the page on our website about the day of action. So just before we leave, I'm going to just give you an opportunity for each of our panelists. If there's something we haven't covered, something you've spotted in the questions, some final thing you want to say, go ahead. Stuart, shall we start with you?
Well, one, thank you for organizing this event, Global Justice Now. There was a question with respect to, from Jen Moore, with respect to Mexico and the new CUSMA deal, the new USMCA agreement. So Mexico, if it wasn't mentioned earlier, does still have an ISDS process within the new NAFTA, but only with respect to the United States. So there's this greatly unequal, completely unreasonable kind of discrimination in this case against Mexico that needs to be dealt with. And Canada can still sue Mexico through the CPTPP. So I just wanted to put those out there. It's not as great a situation as I made it sound with respect to Canada not being covered by ISDS, but nonetheless there is this kind of reprieve, that we have in Canada now, given that all of the cases against us are from NAFTA. A reprieve that shouldn't be ours alone. It should be all countries should have this space to enact policies. So I'll just leave it at that and say thank you again.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Niels, do you want to?
Yeah, just a word of thanks to you as organizers, to all the participants. It's been a very isolating year and a half, and many of these things happen in this case of RV and Uniper in the Netherlands' backyard, and you're campaigning from your laptop screen in your room, and it's really amazing to share a space with so many people in a panel and in a discussion and in a Q&A session, and hopefully on global days of action out on the street, because I really believe that solidarity is key in fighting these global evils. And it's just very thrilling to see so much energy here for your day of action. So I wish you all all the best, and lots of solidarity from us here in Amsterdam to your actions.
Fantastic, Niels. Thanks very much. So, Jean?
Yeah, just thank you to everybody for coming. It's really good to see so many people interested in this. I'm really excited about trying to have a real day of action, hopefully out doing actions, doing activities on the streets. Like Neil said, this is something, so there will be other people in other countries across Europe taking action in September also. It's something that we can do together. We're working with Stuart and others in Canada to try and resist the UK-Canada trade deal together. It's really great if we can try and actually, build some people power around this and try and actually stop the corporate courts.
It is, and a couple of people have been asking how many people came tonight. Well, at its height, I counted 192, and it's dropped off a little bit after have we gone over the hour mark, but I think that's a fantastic turnout actually. And please, order some materials from us. We're really happy to send them out, and think about what you can do, even just a campaign stall. We're very happy to talk to you about it, what might be suitable in your area. Get in touch, and let's raise the profile of this as we run up to COP26, and there's a lot of focus on climate in that period. So thanks everyone for coming, and have a nice summer, and we'll see you on the streets in September.